So first of all, thank you so much for coming. We're really happy to see everyone here. And today we are so glad to have our colleague, and I can say a friend of the Russian Studies workshop at Indiana University, Gertjan Plets, who is a cultural anthropologist and assistant professor at the Utrecht University in the Netherlands. And as I remember correctly, Gertjan participated in 2 our Russian Studies workshops, and actually you were here as a part of the Austrian workshop too. So we can say he's a long-standing friend of Indiana University. So and that's great that we have Gertjan here again at Indiana University. He specializes in corporate heritage funding and indigenous Siberian cultural politics. Gertjan has been working in the Altai Republic since 2009, where he has been tracing the impact of Gazprom corporate social responsibility programs on local cultural politics and cultural heritage preservation initiatives. Before his tenure at Utrecht, Gertjan was based at Stanford University, where he coordinated a research lab exploring the role of cultural heritage in global politics. Gertjan has published on a variety of issues related to heritage and memory politics in Siberia, the woke heritage politics of the Russian government, and the funding of heritage preservation abroad by the Kremlin as a soft power tool in the Middle East. Today, Gertjan Plets is giving a talk on exceptions to authoritarianism, cultural heritage politics, and corporate statecraft in the Altai Republic. So please welcome Gertjan Plets.
Now it's my turn to thank everybody that is here. Usually when I talk about the Altai Republic and politics and cultural politics in Russia and the Netherlands, there's not such a big, enormous, impressive crowd. This is this makes me very nervous in a way. But also I would like to thank Tatjana and everybody at Russian Studies Workshop for inviting me again, because last time I was here, and through the kind invitation of Regina Smith, I had a chance of presenting a paper at the Austrian workshop on the politics of heritage funding in Siberia, and especially the role of big gas and oil money in funding museums and funding cultural institutions. And that was such a great experience. I got so much feedback from it that when I got home, I immediately got to work and rewrote the entire paper, revisited all my field notes, and it ended up really changing my research trajectory a little bit over the past years. Today what I'm going to present here is actually built very much on that feedback that I got the last time. And last time that I gave a paper here, I was giving this traditional dark anthropological recount of how indigenous peoples were being suppressed by big corporations, by the Russian state, and how that implicated how they could celebrate their culture. And then I got a really good feedback during the Austrian workshop. Don't always look to these kind of things in such a bad way. The fact that indigenous people get money from corporations and what they do with it is also interesting to explore. So I started exploring that, and it really gave me a better understanding and a more fine-grained understanding of how culture and cultural politics in Siberia actually work, and the very skillful way indigenous people and indigenous leaders and as real entrepreneurs use culture to really further their agenda. So I hope this time I get as much feedback and criticism as last time, because I'm now in the process of finishing and writing up my book. So hopefully I can also benefit again from being at Indiana University and further fine-tuning my research. So in this presentation I want to basically make 2 points, but it's not really I want to make two methodological points in the study of cultural politics and cultural heritage politics in Russia and beyond. And it sounds a little bit over-ambitious to make 2 points, and not that I want to break new ground, but I want to contribute to ongoing discussions in this presentation, both in the field of heritage studies and cultural politics, but also in the field of Russian studies and how authoritarianism and cultural politics is studied in Russia. And the first point that I kind of want to make in this presentation is it is a bit, there's a methodological issue in how cultural heritage is often being studied in the political field. There's a certain focus on there's very much a focus on the role of the state. There's always a lot of attention in critical analysis of how the past is being presented, and today there's a lot of emphasis on the state. The state is a very important player, but there's a suite of other players that have very strong impact that are not always studied because we do not have the right methodological tools and theoretical tools to understand these. Another problem in the study of heritage and history and the politics of history more generally, I would argue, is that it is often being conceptualized as a zero-sum game, especially in authoritarian states. Only one specific interpretation of history can be allowed, and especially only one specific historical discourse can be allowed in a national museum context. Alternative interpretations of that history and competing interests often in traditional theory are seen as not possible in a national museum. And I think in this presentation I'm going to show an example where a historical narrative that is very negative in a way for the interests of the Russian state still can get presented in a Russian museum. So this encourages us to look at the politics of history and heritage in a slightly different way and adopt a more flexible toolkit. I think the second methodological issue I want to raise is more broadly on how we study cultural politics in authoritarian states in general. In authoritarian states in general, but perhaps also in Russia more specifically. We have this tendency, there's this tendency in literature, if cultural politics are already studied in Russian studies, because that's not always the case. There's this tendency to adopt this, what I would call a single dominant sovereign perspective. There's this attention for one body of power that is the key protagonist in the cultural field, and that one key political player, the Kremlin in this case, allows and carefully manages the cultural field to further specific construction of identity, and especially undermines institutions and players that would present competing interests. And that's of course very much the whole vertical perspective that is central in Russian studies. This idea that there's one focal point of sovereignty, the Kremlin, and the Kremlin is very much obsessed to a certain extent with maintaining that strong vertical organization of power and in creating a whole legal framework that ensures that this vertical body of power is being maintained and strengthened. And this perspective to culture and authoritarian states is to a certain extent very much the case. What we see, for example, with Pussy Riot, how culture, especially now, is being instrumentalized in a post-oil context, not a post-oil, but in a context where oil is not earning that much money for the national economy anymore, and how culture is being weaponized in Russia. There's a lot of studies about this recently coming up. And the image there is depicted that culture, identity, history is very carefully being managed by the Russian state and in a very dominant single uniform way. And the goal a little bit of my presentation today is to show that although this is the case and culture is being heavily weaponized to create a specific identity, to normalize a specific organization of the state, we should not only look at this in a too uniform way. Actually, a lot of exceptions are being allowed by the Kremlin, and I would argue, building on the framework of Galman, how he studies liberal and authoritarian democracies, that these exceptions to the rule, these exceptions to how culture is usually being used, are actually very interesting to look at and teach us a lot on how this Russian state is being organized. So my argument is a little bit not to look at these authoritarian states within discussions of politics in a too uniform way, actually to see these authoritarian states as very flexible states, allowing a lot of exceptions in the organization and in the management of culture. So, how am I going to make this argument in this presentation? I'm going to take you to the Altai Republic. For me, it's very obvious where the Altai Republic is, but every time I give this presentation, I usually forget to include a map, because not a lot of people know where the Altai Republic is. So I include the map for this presentation. I'm going to keep it for the next couple of presentations as well, probably, because although it's almost the size of France, it's very far away. And how I'm going to make this argument, these 2 points that I want to raise, I'm going to do that through a tool that anthropologists often do, a case study. And the case study that I'm going to present to you is basically a conflict over the control over a heritage heritage object, and namely a 2,600-year-old body that was excavated in 1993 by Russian archaeologists. And since its excavation, there has been a long struggle by different parties to control this piece of heritage. So I'm gonna, and how I'm going to structure this presentation. First, I'm going to quickly explain this conflict, how this conflict teaches us already a lot about the role of culture and heritage in the management of ethnic relations. Then I'm going to show how that. So first, I'm going to show how this object became politicized, and then I'm going to especially focus on what happened with this piece of heritage after the Altai Republic became a resource frontier. After the Altai Republic became important for Gazprom, for the and how this region became very important in the plans of Gazprom to construct a major pipeline to China through this region. And this moment where the Altai became a resource frontier became significant for Gazprom. Cultural politics and cultural life in this region completely changed. It actually changed to a certain extent in a negative way for the indigenous people, but at the same time it provided them a lot of opportunities to express and frame their national identity in a national museum context through the money of a corporation that is often connected to the Kremlin. And I'm going to interpret this. So I said I want to make 2 methodological points, one on heritage studies, one on studying authoritarianism in Russia. I think I also want to make a 3rd point in this presentation. I see that there's a lot of undergraduate and graduate students here. The presentation that I'm giving here is actually, to a certain extent, the result of personal failure, you could call. At a certain moment in my PhD research, I was so convinced, and I had this beautiful interpretation that fitted within the dominant paradigm of authoritarianism and cultural politics in Russia. And then a couple of months before submitting my thesis, all of these interesting stuff started to happen that did not conform to my big theory anymore. And I know a lot of people then usually freak out and think, oh no, a lot of graduate students present here probably have already gone through this moment and are afraid of submitting then, and are very wary of their existence at that moment. But I think what I'm going to show here is that or try to show here is if that happens during your trajectory as a researcher, it's usually a good thing, because it shows that you understand the dynamics in your context a little bit better. So this is also a story of failure, which is sometimes also very good to talk about. So, the case study that I'm going to talk about. I didn't include a picture of the body I'm going to talk about. There's a lot of competition within Altai and indigenous leaders on what to do with this body, to present it or not, so I decided not to present it. But so what happened? In 1993, during the summer of 1993, Russian academics Russian archaeologists of the Russian Academy of Science discovered a uniquely preserved 2,600-year-old body of a Scythian lady. The Scythians, and it was really a unique discovery. Does everybody know here Ötzi, that was discovered in the Alps? So Ötzi is a very well preserved mummy, you could say. The flesh is preserved, everything is preserved. Well, this is a little bit the Siberian Ötzi. Everything was preserved in that burial ground. It was quite big, it was quite rich. And because the ground in Altai stays frozen throughout most of the year, it was like, when they made this discovery, it was like opening a prehistoric freezer. And in archaeology, we usually find a couple of pieces of pottery, and that's everything. And then we might make wild theories about that. But this was really a unique discovery because everything was preserved. And this body was preserved, was discovered at a very important moment, 1993, right on the moment when the indigenous inhabitants of the Altai Republic, shamanists, were reviving their culture. This was in the midst of the so-called parade of sovereignties, when a lot of groups and non-Russian groups were starting to rediscover their identity, and especially a lot of basically elites and indigenous elites that have their training in the Soviet Union, they started to revive their culture. So for a lot of the leaders in the Altai region, this discovery came at the right moment. It enabled them to reconstruct and rediscover Altaian identity. And that was also necessary, and I'm now going to say something that doesn't make me popular in Altai, because Altaian identity did not exist before the Soviet Union. Altaians were constructed under Stalinism as part of the Kolonizacja, because they needed to consolidate the tribes to get these indigenous nomads on the roads to communism. So a culture was invented. So these indigenous leaders, for them, this discovery came at the right moment, at the right time, to reinvent Altaian identity. And it was a very valuable symbolical piece of capital, this body, because this body was discovered with a whole range of pieces of material culture that's referred to what is important for Altaians today, that's nomadism and shamanism. So there were a lot of stuff in that grave that really enabled them to create a narrative and normalize a narrative that they have always been nomads, they have always been shamanists, and most importantly, they have been living in this land since 2,600 years old. So quickly, this body, the discovery was really welcomed in the 1993, 1994. She was being the reconstructions of her clothing. She was being used in festivals, and she, although the archaeologists called her the Ice Maiden, she quickly became known in the Republic as the Altai Princess, the mythical progenitor from which all the indigenous people in this region from which they came. And at the same time, she was used to construct Altaian identity, but at the same time, the indigenous elites also start to struggle to control her. And especially they wanted to control her because she was taken away from the region by Russian archaeologists. So she became also the symbol for, although it was never explicitly named like that, but in the discourse and through interviews, I discovered quickly that she was being used as some kind of a metonym to negotiate colonialism and to critique Russian colonialism that had been defining Altaian everyday life since then. What was a juicy detail, she was taken away by a Russian helicopter from the army, from the border service. That helicopter crashed down. She was then transported to Moscow, to the mausoleum of Vladimir Lenin, to be preserved there. So there's all these very interesting narratives interwoven into her life. So she quickly became used by these intellectual elites not only to create an Altaian history, which is actually a very modernist way of creating an identity. Anthony Smith would be very proud to a certain extent. But they also, the struggle over control was really being mediated through the lens of the Altaian religion. And she was being used as an example that their religion, shamanism, is a correct religion, and that it is also a legitimate national religion for the Altaians. What is interesting with Altaian shamanism is they believe that you cannot, once buried, you cannot be excavated. Once you're buried, you become part of the land, and if you disturb this unity between the living and the dead, that is the dead and the landscape, the dead come back to haunt the living. Everything that actually went wrong in Russia from 1993 onwards by the Altaian elites was being used to explain her excavation, her being away from the motherland was being used to explain all these kinds of disasters that were happening. For example, the shelling of the White House in 1993 was connected to the discovery of this body. An earthquake in the Altai Republic in the early 2000s was being connected to the removal of the Altai princess, and also the major thing that was being connected with the Altai princess by the indigenous elite was Chechnya. Chechnya was not a result of indigenous and complex politics. No, it was the result of this body being removed. So it's very interesting that indigenous people kind of say, like, everything that is going wrong in Russia today, that's the cause of them taking our princess away. So quickly what they did was they asked for her repatriation to their national museum, and this really became a theme during most of the regional elections. Most of the regional elections that, of course, were about continuing colonial relationships, the problem to consolidate their identity. It was always negotiated through cultural heritage, through this body, because this was something very tangible, but it was also a relatively safe topic to discuss about. And the great thing that happened with this struggle over this heritage object, it created unity. It brought people together, and it cascaded into other. It really consolidated the Altaian group and brought them more closely together. And in a way, what we're seeing happening throughout the 1990s as this struggle over heritage really brought the groups together, and they were really very successful throughout the 1990s at really opposing a lot of policies of the Russian state. For example, one of the major things they did was they were able to stop the construction of a major hydroelectric dam in the region. So, and other types of national infrastructure, they were able to stop the construction of this. But I think one of the major things, what happened due to this heritage conflict, was that it brought people together, and it helped them in becoming an autonomous republic within the Russian Federation. And they quickly, through all these kind of processes, they were able to, they kind of used this heritage, this heritage narrative in their negotiations for their power treaty already. And there's a couple of other heritage conflicts already in the 1980s that were being used. And they really were very successful throughout the 1990s through these very powerful conflicts and these symbolic dossiers, and bringing the group together, and also getting quite a lot of things done from the Russian state. So they became they became their own republic with their own constitution, and what was very important, they had their own heritage and cultural laws. And one of the great things that was put central in these legal frameworks was the right to control their own heritage, and also the right to control archaeology. For a lot of people that are not in archaeology here, that might sound very mundane, but the possibility to control your own ground and what is in the ground is a very important step in mediating sovereignty and cultural sovereignty. The Russian archaeologists were not too happy with this thing. The Russian archaeologists were very, very angry. They said things that are obscurantists, that are just shamanists. One of the major things that they used to refuse to repatriate was in this body there was DNA preserved. And the DNA, objectively seen, said that this body was not at all related to the people that live there today. And it's also kind of normal in a way, because Central Asia has a very complex genetic story. So the Russian archaeologists countered this narrative of the Altaians being there for a long time, and they argued that modern Altaians have no rights to undermine archaeological research, because archaeologists now have to ask for approval, because they do not have any biological link to the ice age. And for most of the 2000s, for most of the 1990s, the government did not explicitly intervene. The president did not take a point. They did not actively, and the federal state did not necessarily get involved in this conflict. This started to change when Putin came to power. The archaeologists quickly received a very prestigious prize for the discovery of one of the major prizes that they could get for accomplishments in the science. And in the national discourse, this mummy was increasingly being framed as part of Russian heritage. What was also very important is that this unique legal framework that gave indigenous people in Altai control over their own heritage, that was annulled, because in 2002 the Russian federal state created this new heritage legislation that stipulated that basically everything in the soil in Russia is Russian heritage and not indigenous heritage. And in 2012, this law of the Altaians that gave them power was being annulled through the Constitutional Court. And in 2010s, you see that a lot of this heritage activism of the indigenous people really is being curtailed very, very strongly in the Altai Republic. One of the first things that you see around 2010s is that instead of recognizing the Altaians, a group of something like 60,000, 70,000 people as an indigenous group, all the separate tribes within the bigger Altaian national group, they were recognized as small numbered people of the north. So all these separate tribes were being recognized as indigenous people, recognized under their tribal name. So there was, in a way, a trick from the Kremlin to break up these different groups and give them their own institutions and then their own recognition, and not the bigger national consolidation, and undermine that national consolidation that had been happening since the 1990s. A second thing that happened in those 2010s was Ripon was being dissolved for a very short time, and very importantly also the Altaians had been able to elect their own president or their own chairman of the Altai Republic for quite a long time, and that was really in a typical Siberian fashion a former chairman of the collective farm that from a very indigenous Altaian group with an Altaian background, and he was pushed away by a police officer with clear connections to United Russia and the Secret Service. And I think one of the major things that was happening around these 2010s was also that Altaian language, which was for a long time also an official language in the Republic. First at universities they were not allowed to teach it anymore, and then it was also seen, and its status as the official language was also being challenged. So that's where I come with my first failure in 2012. All these things were happening, and this really fit, and the Altai princess was staying in Russia, in Novosibirsk. So I came up with this very straightforward interpretation. She's never going to return to the Altai people because she's increasingly being claimed as Russian heritage, and the things are not in favor actually of the indigenous people that in Altai. They're really under pressure through these very well-known legal frameworks that have been discussed in literature, and within broader literature the argument is being made that indigenous culture is increasingly being folklorized in large parts of Siberia, and the political value of culture is being undermined in a concerted way through all these different types of legal frameworks that make it difficult for indigenous people to give them the tools and legal frameworks and institutions to really express their identity.